And we are live. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening for our first series of the Ask the Expert International Perspectives on Cannabis, Part 1. We are quite excited to have had this opportunity given to us by Cannabis and Psychosis to host this event. So just to remind everybody, we'll be live from Project VoxCan and Cannabis and Psychosis Facebook pages, as well as from Cannabis and Psychosis YouTube channel. If you miss any portion of this discussion, don't worry. This live discussion will be reposted again soon after the live ends, and you'll be able to watch the whole thing back. I would like to first start off with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that VoxCan is headquartered on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation on the island of Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal. I will now let my co-host, Coco, introduce Project VoxCan and Cannabis and Psychosis.
Yeah, so VoxCan is a bilingual cannabis education initiative that was built by youth and for youth based in Montreal. We use a variety of strategies to position young people as the drivers of their own cannabis education by providing opportunities for them to engage with evidence-based information and the support for informed decision-making. And Cannabis and Psychosis is a project of the Schizophrenia Society of Canada. And this award-winning project actually generates a lot of important information about the reasons that young people use, their lived experience, and what they felt was important to communicate to other youth about key issues relating to cannabis and psychosis. So we can go ahead and introduce ourselves. Maybe Laura, if you want to start.
Thank you, Coco. So first off, just to give you the general theme of the event, so today we'll be discussing the different histories and cultures surrounding cannabis that have existed in almost every part of the world. So tonight we'll be trying to answer different questions on how cannabis is regarded and used in different historical and cultural contexts. And for this first session of the two-part series, Ask the Expert, we've had the chance of having a panel of experts with various professional and cultural backgrounds to share with us their experiences, views, and understandings on different regional cannabis use. So just as a reminder for everybody, we'll be having part 2 of this series on May 20th at 6 p.m. So just make sure to mark off your calendars and join us in May. And for a general sense of what the discussion structure will be tonight, we'll be starting off with introducing our experts and then trying to answer a general question on the historical background of cannabis. And then we wanted to add in our touch, the touch of VoxCan, Project VoxCan, which has followed a more special structure around different teams that surround cannabis. So we usually discuss 4 different axes during our roundtable discussions with youth in CEGEPs and universities in Montreal. And also when we go in with training workshops for educational and healthcare professionals. So we usually discuss the legal, health, social, and educational aspects of cannabis. And tonight we've had the pleasure of having different experts on those different fronts join us. So just to introduce myself, my name is Laura, and I work as the Director of Community Outreach and Events for Project VoxCan. I'm a third-year undergraduate student at McGill University. I'm a major in International Development Studies and Political Science, and I am mostly interested in trying to understand the social, cultural, and political impacts of the war on drugs, as well as exploring future global drug policies. So I'm originally from Bogota in Colombia, and the histories of the war on drugs is especially close to heart. So in my research and interest, I'm trying to deconstruct all of those different aspects. Maybe Coco, if you want to introduce yourself and your role within VoxCan.
Sure. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Coco. I go by she, her. I work as the director of development at VoxCan. I'm really interested in the health sciences and environmental sciences. And that's what I study at McGill. And I'm really interested in youth empowerment, and that is why I'm interested in working with VoxCan. And I was born and raised in China, so I will be also talking a bit about the Asia perspectives as well in cannabis. And yeah, so Fernanda, if you'd like to go next.
Yes, thank you, Coco. Thank you, Laura. My name is Fernanda. I am originally from Mexico City in Mexico, which is also one of the main producers of cannabis and a country where like social political issues tied to cannabis have been particularly important. My background is more in the health sciences. I got a medical degree from National Autonomous University of Mexico, after which I came to Montreal to do a PhD in neuroscience. I am particularly interested and actively engaged in science communication and public engagement in all kinds of topics related to medicine, related to neuroscience, but mostly topics that have also a public health impact. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Fernanda. Stan, can you go ahead and introduce yourself next?
Of course. Thank you again, Coco and Laura, for organizing this event. So I'm Stanislas. I am currently studying in Amsterdam, hence why I will be representing Europe. I have a background in political science and economics at McGill University. I used to be involved with VoxCan more in the past. Primarily, I was always very interested in the policy aspect of cannabis, which I discovered mostly in Montreal, and the impact it had on population, on youth particularly. And these days, I try to get as much as involved as possible on how cannabis on the policy of cannabis in the Netherlands and France, and seeing how it compares, as it is a very changing topic.
Thank you, Stan. And now for our last speaker, Violin, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm especially happy to be here today since I am a native Montrealer. I recently moved to Tennessee to work as an attorney for an intellectual property firm. I'm also a member of the Hemp Alliance here in Tennessee, since cannabis is not exactly a booming industry here yet. But I did graduate law school in Ottawa around when cannabis was legalized in Canada, and that completely shifted my career. I then went to New York and did a master's in environmental law and worked in the food and beverage industry. I worked closely with CBD hemp producers on the farming end, and also on the branding aspect of their industry. I work every day with like CBD producers who are trying to trademark but have issues with federal illegalities here in the United States.
Thank you, Violin. So now that everybody's introduced themselves, we're gonna move forward with our first topic question, which is a more general discussion question on the historical background and origins of cannabis in the different regions that we're all representing today. So before jumping into that topic question, I would actually like to acknowledge that we're not a completely diverse panel today, because there are some regions that are not represented, and that is why we actually wanted to host a second part to this event, where we will be able to have the insights and perspective of different people from around the globe. But to start things off, I would like to ask everybody how or what is your understanding of how cannabis reached your specific question, and how and for what purposes was cannabis originally used in the countries that you're representing? So maybe to start things off, I would like to ask Coco to first try and answer this question, given that the oldest recorded evidence of cannabis use is actually from China. So take the floor, Coco.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you said, some of the earliest archaeological evidence of cannabis was discovered in China. So they found there was hemp like hemp rope imprints on pottery, and also they found hemp cloth. So they assumed that, you know, there were cannabis plants used back in the day, like 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. And yeah, so I know that also in terms of like traditional medicinal use, there was written like records of using cannabis as a plant use, you know, either for like treating like menstrual pain or gout or constipation or malaria, and also even used as like anesthetic to reduce pain during surgery. And I'm not really sure like how the plant got there. Maybe it was native in certain regions, but the plant was recorded to help with certain conditions, and even the word itself in Chinese, it means numb, like it means numbness, so it kind of works with that anesthetic perspective. But yeah, that's how much I know about like the brief history of that. But I know that because China is so big and vast, there must be certain regions where they incorporate cannabis use in their part of the rituals. But it's really hard to study because there's so many tribes and regions in China.
Thank you, Coco. So for this first section, we wanted to go in a sort of chronological order of how and when cannabis was first used around the world. So let's jump to Stan, who can tell us a bit more about the historical background of cannabis in Europe.
So cannabis in Europe has had a pretty big history. It arrived relatively early on. The Scythians, which was a Middle East, a tribe from the Middle East, brought cannabis all the way from the Middle East to Germany around 400 BC. And then there were traces of them being found among ancient Greeks, which used it as early as 200 BC, and it was used as medicine, particularly for edema, ear infections, and inflammations. And very early on, we also found traces of it in the 5th century. But generally, cannabis, but in the form of hemp, of industrial hemp, was extremely important in the industrial development of the continent. Throughout the Middle Ages, we were able to find it in pretty much everything, going from cloves to crops. It was a food, and it was an extremely profitable plant. In the 15th century, up to 80% of clothing in Britain were found to be made out of hemp. When it comes to in France, it also had because I will still be talking about France, it also had a big deal. It was used especially in North America when during the time of colonization, colonists were forced to be growing it in New France, which was brought back all the way to Europe and to France to be sold around. It was a part of the big market, and many things from architecture were used. Many bridges in France were reinforced with hemp, for example. So yeah.
Thank you, Stan. And definitely on the topic of hemp and cannabis in North America, while I was preparing and researching for this event, I found that the oldest written record of hemp in North America is actually from 1585, when Thomas Hariot said that he had found a hemp-like plant growing wild, a plant which yields a fiber suitable for weaving, but is inferior in quality compared to the Cannabis sativa crop. But we know that cannabis reached North America a bit later on, given that South America was first reached by European settlers. So, Fernanda, can you give us a bit more information on the historical background of cannabis in South America, and maybe more particularly in Mexico?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting when we think about the origin of cannabis in Mexico, because for a long time it was debated if cannabis, and especially Cannabis sativa, was already part of the botanical diversity in pre-Hispanic Mexico. But the consensus today is more towards the fact that it arrived with Christopher Columbus. Well, it first arrived like in the form of hemp ropes. And then Hernan Cortés, at least in Mexico, who was the main conqueror back then, introduced a series of plants to what was called like the New Spain to incentivate economy. And although it was initially brought, because as Stan said, in Europe, like one of the biggest sources and the biggest like uses it was given was as a fiber, as a textile. It was very easily, like very quickly, it started being used as a psychoactive plant. In Mexico and South America, there was like a big tradition of ritual plants. So the indigenous communities, at least in Mexico, they were already familiar with peyote, with tobacco for like ritual purposes. So as early as 1550, the Viceroy started pointing at the fact that cannabis could become a problem because indigenous population were using it for something more than making ropes. So it was very quickly developed into another of the ritual plants that were used in Latin America. And well, of course, that eventually developed in one of the into the culture of the different countries we have. Also, like there's historians that mention that African slaves had already a relationship with the plant, and also through the rituals and through their traditions, it became part of like the life of society. But it always had like a racial connotation from the beginning. So since the Viceroys back then were already pointing at the fact that it was the indigenous and the Africans that were using it. And this is I'm just going to put like a post-it here because we're going to come back at it, because this has been like a huge part of the cannabis conflict, at least in Latin America, this racial issue of it always being associated to the popular classes and racial minorities.
Thank you, Fernanda. And I would actually like to add on that in my own research, I found that they were actually able to identify the regions of provenance of the enslaved peoples that could have potentially brought the first seeds of cannabis to the Americas, and mainly in Brazil. So I think the first recorded evidence of cannabis use in the Americas is from 1549, when both the French and British settlers brought in Angolan enslaved people from Angola, who would have brought seeds in cloth dolls, which were tied to their clothing. And actually, because these enslaved people were brought into Brazilian plantations to grow different crops, such as indigo and sugarcane. But at this moment, the planters permitted or allowed the slaves to grow what they called their macona, or cannabis. And they were also allowed to smoke the cannabis plant during periods of inactivity between harvests. But again, as you said, this plant and the different uses, especially the psychoactive uses that were associated with the plant, were racialized from the very beginning. And I found that at first, cannabis was categorized as the opium of the poor. So it could, as we have said before, while it was used first for cordage and clothing, it quickly became also a comestible, a spice, but also an energizer, a medicine, and an euphoriant. And I think we also see the evidence of the different like cultural miscegenation that happened on the American continent across North and South America, where enslaved peoples brought in and shared the knowledge of the plant with mostly indigenous peoples, because the plant again was stigmatized and categorized with certain racialized minorities. And I found also that in Jamaica, if we stick to the American region, it was also similarly introduced, but this time it was actually introduced by the East Indian indentured laborers that were brought by the British. And these laborers introduced what they called ganja to the Black working class. And in this sense, cannabis was integrated with many dimensions of Jamaican culture. And in the case of Colombia, one of the main regions that started growing and using cannabis was the Magdalena River region, which is on the northern Caribbean coast of Colombia, which is also a very, it's a mountain range, but also pretty close to the tropics. So perfect geography and climatic traits to help with the growth and the production of cannabis. I know, Violin, you had also some insight on the legal history of cannabis. So if you want to share with us some of your knowledge on that specific topic.
Sure, and just to complete the thought that you all brought up about racial inequalities with this whole industry, I think one thing that's amazing that we're seeing in the United States with various state cannabis and hemp laws is that everyone is really addressing this. The way it works in the States is that you need to get a license usually before cultivating or selling marijuana. And a lot of these licensure programs have in place a goal or an actual number in the law that says like this amount needs to go to minorities, this amount needs to go to females. So that's awesome. I didn't realize that people even notice this. A lot of times people just look at these laws and are so excited that marijuana is getting legalized that they kind of look over that. So I'm so glad that that was flagged. And then just one other thing that I would add is that in both Canada and the States, we can see that legalization is a process, and obviously marijuana, even hemp, is a little taboo. And I think that the medical laws that were enacted, for instance, in Canada, 10 years before the Cannabis Act in 2018, there were regulations, federal regulations that were put in place to legalize medicinal use. And in the States as well, the first legal marijuana law was in California, and that was for medicinal use as well. So I think that we can see with legislation, it starts really small with incorporating some type of right to use marijuana for medical purposes, and then we grow from there.
Yes, exactly. And I love that you've mentioned that legalization is a process. And I think when we go forward with our different topic questions, we'll see that criminalization itself was also a process that was enacted. And I just want to thank everybody for their insight on the different historical backgrounds of cannabis. And I would like to remind our audience that their questions are more than welcome throughout this live discussion. So just a reminder from our co-host and partner, Cannabis and Psychosis, you can drop your questions at any time in the comment section, and we'll spend some time at the end of this discussion to address some of your more detailed and specific questions. And also just a reminder that we've dropped the link to our Facebook event page for part 2 of the Ask the Expert series, if you want to go and check it out so you don't miss the reminder when it happens. All right, so I think that now that we've covered this first topic question, I will give the mic to Coco so she can start us off with the legal aspect of cannabis across the world.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess we have Violin and Stan here to kind of just chat about the different types of legal status of cannabis and maybe how it evolved. And Violin, you've touched on this a little bit, and maybe just like what's the difference of cannabis status in different parts of the world. In China, it's very much illegal. That's no question there. It's always been illegal. It's like Schedule 1 drugs, like equivalent to Schedule 1 in the US. But and even like CBD products, it's like completely illegal as well in China. But yeah, like just to start off with basics, what is the legal status of cannabis in the US? How is it regulated in different levels of jurisdiction?
So yeah, so as you mentioned, in the US, cannabis is still classed as a Schedule 1 drug, just like in China, I guess. And that's crazy to think because it's like at the same level as cocaine, as like heroin, as really rough drugs. But so we have a federal law, the Controlled Substance Act, that says that it's criminal to use, possess, or cultivate marijuana. But then we have states, like I mentioned, California, who are fed up with this law. And as of 1996, California was the first to enact a law saying that cannabis is legal for certain medical purposes. And that was fine. That didn't disrupt too much. But in 2012, when Colorado decided to legalize cannabis for adult use, that really brought a ton of super conservative states a lot of stress. So they brought that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said, look, we don't want to regulate, we don't want to look at this right now. They found some like weird excuse to not look at it, and they essentially said, we don't know if this program in this state is legal or illegal. And essentially the way that Colorado adopted this law is because, similar to Canada, there's a division of powers between the federal government and the state governments. And whatever is not reserved to federal government in the Constitution goes to the states. So the states can regulate any commercial activity within their borders, whereas the federal government regulates interstate activity. So these states are all, after Colorado, there were several states. There's 33 states now who either decriminalized, legalized for adult use, or legalized for medicinal use. They're all adding their own type of laws that are all super distinct to legalize cannabis. And the only thing that the Supreme Court has said on this is that the supremacy clause applies to these laws. So essentially, any law that conflicts with a federal law, any state law conflicting with a federal law, can be struck down at any time. But no one's doing anything about it. And the reason no one's doing anything about it is because federal laws are worthless unless the government says, hey, let's give money to the DEA or the Department of Justice to go prosecute people who are breaking federal laws. So since 2014, there have been memos sent out by the administrations to say, don't go use taxpayer money to prosecute state legal businesses that are cultivating or selling marijuana, which is super sketchy for anyone who's in the business, because you don't know. Biden can wake up tomorrow and say, hey, let's go spend money and go shut all these places down and put all these people in jail. So it creates a really weird system where also banks, federal banks, cannot interact with these industries. Any type of financial institution doesn't want to interact with the industries because they're afraid. There's no federal law saying this is quality control. You have to have this certain amount of THC in here. You cannot go over this. You can have so many plants or anything like that. There's no regulation on it right now at the federal level. So we just have this weird system. And also people cannot technically go from state to state with the product. So we have this weird taboo where people think they're criminals even if they're purchasing state legal product. And then on the financial aspect of it, we have literally institutions that are cash only because they can't really have proof of anything. And there's like this whole data privacy fear. And then just to add on to that, on 420, actually, this is one positive note. The Safe Banking Act passed in the House, which essentially would allow federal institutions to bank with any state legal entity. But this is the fourth time that they pass it, and it usually gets struck down by the Senate. So it's unlikely to have any progress in that area.
If I may just ask a question to you, Violet, because this is very interesting. I had no prior knowledge of the details around cannabis legalization in the US. But so from what I understand, you're saying that is there an equivalent to Health Canada who supervises and sort of ensures the safety of the products that are on our shelves in cannabis dispensaries?
Well, for cannabis, it's the DEA or the Department of Justice, because there's no actual legalization yet on the federal level, and that's the issue. There's no quality control. The FDA has regulated a bit with hemp and CBD, but in terms of cannabis, there's nothing. So anything that's over 0.3% THC is just not supposed to exist. So then it goes to the states and municipalities to try and regulate it, but it's obviously really difficult because there's no higher power kind of thing that's telling them what to do.
Amazing. It's really interesting. I mean, again, I didn't know of those details, and I promise, Coco, I will pass the mic back to you. But I'm just wondering again, what do you see for the future of cannabis legalization in the US with the way it's going, and in comparison with what has happened in Canada? How do you think? Do you think we will see a day when cannabis is legalized throughout the US at the federal level?
I mean, it's hard to tell. I really thought it would happen under Obama. Obama did create one of the most expansive memos saying that financial institutions shouldn't be too afraid to bank with cannabis industries. He did go out and try to make more of a safe environment for them, but did not manage to legalize it on the federal level. I think maybe Biden seems open to it. He definitely seems open to decriminalization. And with the Safe Banking Act being approved under his administration, it does give hope, but I remain super skeptical with it. I think that the hemp has recently been legalized in the US with the 2018 Farm Bill, and I think that we have to focus on that for the moment. It already has created a lot of issues with people selling hemp that's actually cannabis. So I think that that's only going to create more negativity around it, and I don't think it's going to be legalized anytime soon, but I could be wrong.
So I wanted to jump in because I think it's interesting to think what's going to happen in the United States. I mean, because the legislation in Mexico has always been really dependent on the United States. It was actually the United States that put pressure on Mexican government in the 1920s, 1930s to start making the use of marijuana forbidden. So that has been like that for a long time, and we have this. We share this big border and all these relationships around the matter of illegal substances. And right now in Mexico, there's a law initiative that has already been passed in one of the two chambers, deputies, and they've been postponing and postponing. It was supposed to be resolved in 2008. First, they tried to resolve it in 2018. They pushed it to 2019, and then to 2020, and then pandemic, and then they're trying to figure it out now, because as of today, it's kind of the same rule in the federal level. It's 0.3. Everything that's less than 0.3 THC is legal and mostly for medicinal use. But now they're going to pass, supposedly, this this bill for recreative cannabis, in which all across the Mexican territory will be legal to possess, use, and commercialize, and thinking of doing things like cannabis clubs. And of course, I think one of the reasons it has been postponed is because they need to reach some kind of an agreement with the United States, given all of this shared border and shared issues, especially because even if there are some states in which it has been legalized or regulated, it's still illegal in the federal level. So just wondering how that's going to turn out.
All right. Okay. Is it okay? Thank you. This was very interesting. I know that the United States in general is always it's so influential that even looking at it from a European point of view, the more it moves there, the more it tends to move in Europe as well. And this is what I'm going to talk about, because very often when we think about Europe, we think about and cannabis, we tend to think about the Netherlands, for example, where I currently reside. And I've learned a lot while living here, and it is not as easy as it seems to be. For example, when it comes to the Netherlands, cannabis remains illegal, which, despite popular thinking, it is illegal, but it has been tolerated since 1976. Um, but it remains a very complicated process. So the problem is that since in 1976 it's been removed from the class one. Sorry, is that the right term? In the U.S., the
Schedule 1.
Schedule 1, sorry, the Schedule 1 type. So it is becoming to the second Schedule 2 or Schedule 2, considering it a soft drug. So now cannabis remains in this sort of complicated gray zone, but it is still so far. So, for example, in the Netherlands, it is still illegal to produce, sell, or buy in large quantities, which leaves coffee shops to have to purchase cannabis and from illicit sources. But then they're still allowed to sell it to consumers in smaller batches, which is very interesting because very often when you go to the Netherlands to coffee shops, you cannot know from like the THC. There are no rules around testing whether you can know how much THC there is in it. Usually it comes from unknown sources because it is usually it is not allowed to grow cannabis for commercial purposes, which is very complicated to wrap around the mind. So right now in the Netherlands there is a limit to 5 gram when it comes to cannabis possession for personal use, and then the fines when it comes to having more than 5 grams are very harsh. But that's when the policy of toleration in the Netherlands comes into play, because in 2005, for example, I found that there are only 19 arrests linked to possession of cannabis in the entire year, compared to 225 in France the same year, or 100,000 in the United States. So there's been a big this policy of toleration, which is present in all of the Netherlands, it's very interesting. It's a big part of how they live. Their policy on cannabis is not necessarily appreciated by all, particularly in government, but they're very attached to this. There's been moves to make this status clearer. And so, for example, more recently, I believe since 2016, there have been a pilot to officially to have official approved growers and testers, which would also allow better labeling and to make sure that people would be aware of the quantity of THC and CBD present. But at least in the Netherlands, medical cannabis has been legal since 2003. That is the one part where like the law is relatively clear, but it remains quite limited. The government has a complete control over what is who receives treatment and who does not. So people who do not receive it usually go to coffee shops and consume it for as recreational use. And the Netherlands remains, I'd say, a very like an island of a very special place in Europe, because on the other side, and that's where I will look at France, which is in a whole different world, even though it's been changing much more. In general, substances have been in France have been a big problem. I've wanted to talk about it earlier, but for example, cannabis was first found to be brought back by Napoleon's troops in Egypt, and there are already complaints of bad behavior from soldiers, and which already developed a bad reputation for cannabis at the time. But it also became a very it became part of also an intellectual groups were starting to use it in the late 1800s. In the late 1800s. Sorry. And it became this subversive. It had this subversive idea, and then as of 1970, so they were I'm skipping through a lot of history, but in 1970 there was a bill which heavily punished all offenses against narcotics, legislation from supposed consumption to production, and this bill from 1970 is still very much alive today. And today, France still remains the largest consumer of cannabis in Europe. There are over 5 million consumers of cannabis in France per year, as per estimate. And the legal, until 2018, the legal consequences for being caught with cannabis, for cannabis possession, used to be extremely hard. It used to be from a fine of 3,750 euros, so something like 4,000 euros, to 1 year of prison, to something up to 5 years of prison. But since 2018, and more generally after it's been applied nationally, it is now only a 200 euro fine. So they've been introducing this fine only for example, is a little less than 100 grams cannabis. It may entail lawsuits, but it is aimed at appeasing the harsh consequences, legal and social consequences that the cannabis has on French society, which remains quite yes. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, sorry, Stan. I'm very interested in those two perspectives from France and the Netherlands, because I remember in personal discussions with you that you mentioned how contrasted and different people's attitudes toward cannabis were compared with Montreal and France. And go back to our initial discussion about the racialization of cannabis use, I was just wondering, is that conversation happening in France as well? Is there are there people mobilizing or advocating to recognize that, for example, people either racialized minorities or racialized groups are more likely to be criminalized and penalized for cannabis use compared to the white French population?
Yeah. That is a very interesting question, which coming from a French context can be hard to discuss due to France's particular vision on race, and considering what racializing things can be a very complicated problem. But more generally, statistics show that when it comes to the arrest of on cannabis, it is definitely up to, I think I read some numbers, and don't quote me on this, but it was something like up to 60 to 70% of people arrested for cannabis possession were of North African descent, and that is a big problem. But it is also part of a deeper problem of a large part of this population relying very often on this economy, on this background. On this underground economy. On this underground economy, it is also for law enforcement a sort of perverse, let's say, source of income, even though that's probably not the right way of framing it. But for example, here right in front of me, I know I have found that between 2000 and 2015, the increase in cannabis arrests has been gigantic. In 2000, it was around 14,000 people, and in 2015, it's around 140,000 people. So it's improved massively. And there's definitely a racialized aspect to it. There's no question to it. And it's been particularly in places around large cities like Marseille, Paris, where there is a large concentration of racialized people. So yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Stan.
Yes,
go ahead.
The criminal aspect, I just wanted to follow up on that, because a part of the legalization of cannabis and regulation is also the criminalization of cannabis consumption, purchase, sale, growth. I wanted to toss this to Abalin, what is kind of the history of criminal law on cannabis? For example, Canada's legalization with cannabis, after the Cannabis Act that was introduced, what's happening to those folks who have a criminal record or are, you know, currently in jail for possession? Like what's happening to them? Yeah, I'd love to just hear your insights on that.
So there are a few elements to that. The first one is that the Cannabis Act basically made it no longer a crime as of the Cannabis Act to not to use, possess, or sell cannabis. And that's essentially like the main power of the federal government, because that act just set the basis. It said like that's not a crime, and then it said like the specific like ages, like I think it's 18 in Canada, where you can purchase cannabis, and then it said a specific household may have I think up to 4 plants per dwelling house. But then the provinces have actually the power to come in and say, no, I want to change. I want to change the actual age. I want to change what's permitted within my borders. And then on top of it, you have municipalities who also have power to say what's criminal and not criminal. So if you look at Quebec, Quebec is very similar in the cannabis industry to the alcohol industry, where it's all run by the government. And what you see is that you have the SQDC selling, basically that's the only dispensary, but it's technically still a crime if you want to be your own person and go open a dispensary, your own brick and mortar shop, you know, that's still a crime. And then you have in Toronto, for example, different Toronto says in its borders, you can have as many dispensaries as you want that aren't state province owned. But then you drive like a few minutes away, hopefully if there's no traffic, to Mississauga, and there's no dispensaries. You're not allowed because that locality said it's a crime to own a dispensary. So it's still super ambiguous, and there's still a lot of questions as to people who were arrested, you know, before the Cannabis Act was enacted, over what's going to happen to those people. There are a lot of questions about like DUIs with criminality. And even though the Cannabis Act was passed 3 years ago, these are still things that both the federal government and provincial governments are still figuring out. And unfortunately, I mean, there's no proof to this, I guess, but I'm sure that there are still a lot of racial inequities in that aspect. I think it's definitely going to be a rollout over several years before we realize what is actually going to happen. Are we just going to expunge all these people? But the way it stands, anyone who was arrested for anything that was criminal before the act was enacted, they're technically still criminals. I mean, they did something that was illegal at the time that they did it.
And what about the US? Like, it just wanted to quickly touch on that. Like, in terms of criminal offenses, is it similarly charged in Canada as well, like similar to Canada, or completely different system in the US?
It is. I always make this joke, whereas Canada basically said it was no longer criminal in 2018, and then provinces came out with their own regulations. In the States, we have the flip. States are coming out with different regulations trying to decriminalize it within their state, but then you have no federal act saying it's no longer a crime. But as it stands, when you're in a state where it's legal, you're not going to get put in jail if you're following whatever standards are within their laws. If it says like, you know, you could own so much, then you're allowed to own that much in the state. And you're not going to have right now a federal officer come in and arrest you for it, because they're not being funded to do that. But technically, if they really wanted to, and this comes in with a lot of race issues too, if someone really wanted to be a bad person, could come in and arrest someone for that, because it's still federally a crime, and it's a very serious crime because it's a Schedule I drug.
That is so interesting. And the contrast you made between the US and Canada is also really interesting. I'd never thought of it in that perspective. But thank you to everybody, to Stan and Violin, and also Fernanda for this discussion on the legal aspect. We wanted to move to the health dimension of cannabis use. And for this section, I wanted to ask Coco, from her research and her knowledge, what she knew about the original medicinal use of cannabis in China. And maybe if you can touch on if it was or it wasn't used in traditional Chinese medicine. So yeah, if you can just tell us a bit more about that subject.
Yeah, sure. So it's documented as a plant as many other plants with its benefits and effects on a human body. In this really famous book, it's essentially a book of like different types of plants that this person wrote by testing the plants himself, and it's a book that's very widely used for a lot of traditional medicine practitioners. And so from what I know is that like it was actually the research on cannabis was ongoing a bit in 1930s, 1940s, and when the the people of Republic of China is established after established, there's actually a huge crackdown on cannabis, and because the cannabis is actually like viewed as something similar to opium, even though it's very different like substances and different plants than poppies, but because of the effects, as Stan kind of mentioned, like makes persons seem like they're lazy or kind of sedated, and because of the history of opium war in China, there's a huge negative connotation to anything right that makes someone a bit more relaxed into a sedated state to an extreme. So because of that, there's a huge negative perception on cannabis, and it's not really widely used in China at all. And to my knowledge, my own mother, who was a doctor in China, and she said that it's really not widely known in China, unfortunately, in the modern day in China, and it's very much illegal to use.
Right. Thank you, Coco. And I mean, go ahead if you want to jump in and answer this following question. But I think maybe Fernanda can also help us bridge the gap in how we can perceive the transition between medicinal cannabis use and more traditional uses, and how it came to be reappropriated by modern Western practices. So Fernanda herself is a medical doctor, and she has a lot of knowledge on how we use cannabis nowadays, and especially in countries that have legalized its medicinal uses. But yeah, if you want to jump ahead, Fernanda, and tell us a bit more about how we can link the legalization of cannabis to its medical uses.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Well, I think first of all, like it goes like medical uses, then stigmatization, and then legalization, and coming back again to the medical uses. It's very interesting because I mean there's the first record in Chinese, ancient Chinese medicine, it's from 2700 BC. Okay, that's where it appears in the first pharmacopoeia of a Sheng Nung pen, and it's mentioned for uses like malaria or constipation, and that's like way before it starts being mentioned in Western pharmacopoeia. The first time it appears in a Western medical textbook, it's in 1563. So it's like what, almost 3,000 years of difference. So it's just amazing how this plant that has been known to have many properties, like from long ago, due to all the stigma that has surrounded it, has been blocked to its use in modern medicine, which has had many impacts. So there's one impact in public health of like cannabis being illegal, which is we don't know what we consume. So if there's anything that's going wrong, we don't know what exactly we were using. We know it's a plant, we know it can have cannabinoids, but we don't know exactly the chemical composition of it. So that creates one problem in terms of health because we don't know what we're using, and because it is illegal and the black market flourishes, it can have compounds that are added to dry it faster or stuff like that. It can be toxic. It can, so that implies some risks for health on one side. On the other side, because of all this stigmatization, we had between the 15, I said 1563, it appeared at first. Then I read also in Mexico, it was around 17 something. It was starting to be explored as a medical use. In the 19th century, it was actually sold like for many types of illnesses. There was never like rigorous biomedical research on its properties, on its real biomedical properties. And when it started to be researched, it was stigmatized, it was prohibited, it was forbidden, which like created this big gap in what this plant is doing. And what we know today is also that even if it's, yes, it's a plant, it's like three genus of the, like one genus of the plant, cannabis, with three subvarieties. There's many substances in the plant, and different substances have different properties. So it's astounding how, like, well, since regulations started to change in the US, in Canada, in other places, opening the door to medicinal cannabis again, like research came back into it. And now there's so much interest and so many people are jumping into it, but there's also like a huge, like, scam industry of, like, for example, CBD, that we don't really know it's CBD being sold as like for everything. So there's no, I think it's important to know that there's no universal substance that can cure everything. I understand also the reaction of people that have been drawn to cannabis from like a long time or even traditionally, and that it has been taken away from them to now think it's some kind of like miracle substance. But of course, like, or it has a miracle substance in it, but of course it's not. So the, like, now it has to be like reappropriated by biomedical science and start, doing trials, at least in places where it's legal, or even like only the medical or the research aspect of it, to start discovering, is it good for this condition or not? What are the conditions, like what are the circumstances under which it can and can't be used? And when we think about it, and we think we're like in 2021, and the first medical uses started being documented in 2700 BC, we think that we have lost so much time in the research of the properties of this plant. And in the meantime, we have created public health issues because of the consumption of substances that are not, we don't know exactly what is in there, because of black market has opened the door to like doing things or adding things to the plant, contamination, either with bacteria or fungi or stuff they add. So we have created this public health issue around the plant, regardless of the legal issue, of course, and of the public health issue of mental health, and of, there's, like in the United States or in Canada, there's people that are in jail because they were smoking a joint, because they were like actually hitting a joint of cannabis, and they are in jail now because it was a crime back then and they gave them. So people that could have a future were thrown into jail and they're not reintegrating to society. So that's kind of like the mental health issue, right? But on the other side, we have this public health issue of consuming what we don't know. And one of the big advantages of regulation is the possibility of educating people, educating what they are consuming, what they are smoking. Are you going for something that has more CBD, more THC? Do you know what terpenes are? And this is impossible if you're just getting your cannabis from the black market, which is the case in everywhere where it's not legalized. And even, and maybe I'll like to ask Dylan about that, because I know that I read once that in California, even years after legalization, the black market was still very strong. So many people were still buying in the black market, where like it's not, the product is not as regulated. So yeah, before transitioning to someone else who wants to add either on this topic of health or the link between health and legal, I would like to thank everybody that's watching us and motivate you to ask questions, sharing your perspectives with us so that we can have a more open discussion.
Thank you, Fernanda. So I don't know, Violin, if you have maybe some insight into what Fernanda just mentioned about the black market resisting legalization in California.
I mean, that's absolutely true. The clandestine crops in California are outrageous, and there's a huge environmental aspect to that too. A lot of the illegal enterprises are super environmentally unfriendly, and a huge part of that again is because they don't have the type of funding that legal enterprises can have, so they don't invest in sustainable infrastructure. But what's even more striking is in states where only hemp is legal and places are selling CBD, a lot of times they're actually selling marijuana, and sometimes they're not even they're afraid because if they showcase or they advertise that they're selling marijuana, then they may get into some issues with law enforcement. So sometimes some people who are actually going to buy CBD are accidentally purchasing edibles that are getting them high, which is a huge problem. And then on top of that, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Delta 9 is essentially what we know as weed, as cannabis, but there's Delta 8, there's Delta 12, Delta 10, there's everything. And those are in a super murky area in terms of legality. So CBD companies are selling Delta 8, which gets you high. So that's a whole other aspect of the black market that's becoming an issue because some people actually just want CBD and they're not getting that.
Yeah, just adding to that, another big problem in terms of public health is with what we call synthetic cannabinoids that are sometimes marketed as Spice, K2, Black Mamba, and you can find them on the internet and saying they are just alternatives to THC, but these are actually derivatives of THC made in a lab with no control. So you really don't know what you're getting, and the effects are really unpredictable. And there have been cases of very bad intoxication with this kind of compound. So they give you the shredded plant, but they spray the synthetic thing on it, and then this can cause all kind of medical emergencies. And because you don't know what you got, it's very hard to know what the person actually used. So it's another impact of having this on the black market. And for people that they maybe, as you say, maybe they just wanted CBD, or maybe they just wanted, normal weed, but because they can't get it, they're going to go for these synthetic cannabinoids. It seems so fancy and easy to get, and it's in a legal void. So they go for that, and it can have bigger impacts in terms of people's health.
Thank you, Fernanda and Violin, for complementing each other on the link between legality, criminalization, and health. It really, I think, brought to mind many things that came up in my research when I was preparing to discuss what's going on in Colombia and what has been happening in the past decades in terms of drug production and use. So while I was researching, of course, what are the latest news in terms of cannabis legality in Colombia, I found, and I was just reminding of how Colombia has been associated for so long with very violent drug production and drug distribution, and how every time someone mentions Colombia, the first name that comes to mind is Pablo Escobar, and how everything that surrounds and the many dimensions that both cannabis and cocaine production have in Colombia, all of those dimensions I've just been evacuated from the discourse. But I was thinking, and maybe Fernanda, there's a link with the Mexican context as well, in the sense that while we talk about public health, I think you've mentioned different factors that can influence a good or a bad mental health, public health in different states and countries. And in the case of Colombia, what I think is so important for people to know about the specific regions and the struggles they've had with drug production, criminalization, and legalization nowadays is that the drug use is not the primary problem. We have to look at the social conditions that have created not only problems in terms of drug, the substance use and substance dependency, but also the conditions that have created or that have mapped out the scene for these powerful and violent drug cartels to emerge and to really almost take over the whole state. At some point in the early 2000s, Colombia was considered as a narco state because corruption and drug and cocaine money had infiltrated institutions and the government so far in that people didn't even know who was really ruling the country anymore. Was it the actual elected officials, or was it the cartel members and the drug traffickers who had so much money, so much power and influence because of the terror they were instilling in people in the countryside? And yeah, just to maybe go over briefly what has been happening in Colombia since the 1960s. Actually, cannabis has been grown in Colombia since the 17th century. And again, just like in Canada, it was cannabis and other substances were actually criminalized after much of American influence in the 1920s. Cannabis was actually criminalized in Colombia in 1946. And in some regions, and then criminalized all across the country in 1949, when it was conveyed as this substance with venomous and addictive properties. But then what happened in the 1960s is that there was this armed conflict that emerged out of historical social conditions where lack of public services and lack of security in the countryside which was explained by systemic government negligence, led to peasants and leftist people from the left and intellectual circles and advocacy circles to take up arms against the national government because there were regions that just were abandoned totally from the time of colonization and who were never regarded nor supported by the national state. And the two first decades of this armed conflict were relatively low, very low in violence. But what happened in the 1980s is that cocaine production became more and more productive, and this became a new economic interest, not only for guerrilla groups, for leftist armed groups, but also for these new drug trafficking cartels, but also these paramilitary groups that had tied with that were tied to the national government. And you just have all of these different groups that become really interested in profiteering from drug production to finance their illegal activities. And this new economic interest just gave these different groups more interest to continue a civil conflict, in the sense that if you have an ongoing armed conflict, no one's going to bother to take a look at who's actually growing and producing drugs for exportation. And what I found interesting while doing this research is that just recently in 2016, we have had the first peace treaty that has been signed by the national government and the main armed group that has been involved in this fight for over 50 years. And one of the peace, or maybe one of the main points of the peace treaty that needed to be addressed was the historical social conditions that were set in place and that were favorable to the emergence of a violent drug trafficking cartel all across the country. And if I can just read an excerpt from one of the policy brief that was presented by the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace. And what he says here is that the solution to the problem of illicit crops requires a strategy that is focused on human rights. It's not only a matter of having cocaine-free territories, but also about ensuring the full exercise of rights and liberties to rural communities. And I found this to be extremely powerful because you have this country that has been literally at war, and Colombian people have been at war with each other for 60 years. I mean, you have just generations of people who have never known peace. And all of these social conditions and the fact that people are so traumatized by the civil war have led people to be extremely skeptical of drugs, in the sense that they've always been associated with violent groups. And so now that the peace treaty has been signed and that the issue of illicit crops and illicit drugs has been put at the forefront of the conflict, there is some push by the government to decriminalize and legalize some byproducts of cannabis. But the social conditions that have put so much fear in people's minds, it's like they don't. Of course, there are some activists pushing for cannabis legalization in Colombia, but there's also so many people from mostly my parents' generation, I believe, who have witnessed firsthand the atrocities and the violence that arises from this lucrative business, and who are just against it. They just don't want to even hear about it because it triggers so many violent and terrible memories. But nevertheless, in Colombia, since 2015, I believe, there's been a law that has legalized medicinal cannabis. And interestingly enough, they aren't allowed to actually sell the flower of cannabis. They only sell byproducts, so oils and topic creams. And another element I wanted to add is also that by doing this research, there's this green gold fever that they call that has been happening since Colombia legalized medicinal cannabis. And there's some estimations that say that in some years, Colombia could come to produce 1/5 of the global market for medicinal cannabis because of its very specific geographic and climate characteristics that make cannabis like a very easily grown plant, very easily grown flower, and the fertile lands yield very large produce. And I was very concerned to learn that either way, there's very little consideration for the people who have been most hurt by the armed conflict that has been in part financed by drug like cocaine and cannabis production. And these people, I feel like, aren't part of the conversation of how we're going to legalize and how we're going to market medicinal cannabis. And just recently, there's been some business going on between Canadian cannabis businesses and Colombian businesses. And I think very, very recently, if not already, we will have Colombian cannabis on shelves of cannabis dispensaries here in Canada. And I think it's, even though the markets are opening up, I think it's very important to keep this lens of who is benefiting the most and who has been hurt the most by cannabis criminalization. So that is, I don't know, that is what I wanted to add to this whole conversation. I don't know if the Mexican context might be a bit more different or similar in some ways, but I would like to hear Fernanda on that topic before we move to audience questions.
Yeah, for sure. I actually wanted to jump in before we do Q&As. So there's some similarities and some differences. I think the conflict, the war conflict in Colombia started earlier than in Mexico. And actually, at the beginning of the 2000s, we spoke about the Colombianization of Mexican politics and Mexican conflict, in the sense that what was like for Colombia in the 90s is the way that it's kind of something similar is happening in Mexico now. So in the sense of how the drug violence came out of control. And in the case of Mexico, one of the reasons was a conservative government that decided they wanted to do a war on drugs, with a lot of like arguments of we're going to avoid drugs from coming to your children, la la la. And basically what they did was that they disrupted the kind of like tacit organization of three big cartels that were doing their thing. There were some conflicts among them, but I mean, under certain like rules and internal regulations and corruption, of course. But this particular government opened fire on the cartels, but I don't think they realized how bad the government was infiltrated. So it was kind of the same thing in the terms of a narco state. So what they did was they broke the big cartels. The big cartels became a bunch of smaller cartels fighting for power, and then it became kind of a civil war with a lot of casualties. Actually, I think that if we put together all the casualties, it's bigger than the Iran and the Afghanistan war together in Mexico. So it was very bad, and it's still the case that there's a lot of violence towards drugs, and it's also related to how cannabis became stigmatized, because the big drug cartels built their empire based on cannabis. Well, they were also like a passage for Colombian cocaine from Colombia to the US. That was another side business. But what was growing in Mexico was mostly cannabis. And after that, they passed to everything, to grow all kind of other substances, to, do kidnapping and, slavery of people and all kind of like terrible, terrible things. And now that there's this law that is kind of trying to pass, and in part two, we're probably going to have like an expert cannabis activist from Mexico that will be able to go into this in more detail. But the issue is that they've been postponing, but there's a whole human rights problem in Mexico now due to cannabis prohibition. And another interesting thing, and like on one side, we want the law to pass. But on the other side, there's a lot of organizations of activists and human rights people saying, well, we don't just want it to pass. We want to make sure that, as Laura was saying, all these peasants and all these communities that have been first badly affected by drug violence, and second, badly stigmatized for growing cannabis, the peasants in the different rural areas, are going to get, a fair regulation, because after all they've gone through, now we're going to open the door to big, corporations. Also, there's a lot of interest in Canadian weed business for Mexico, because as Colombia has a very nice weather when you can grow cannabis all year long. So eventually it's going to be an issue of asking ourselves where our cannabis comes from in Canada when it's legal, kind of like what we do with our food, or what some of us do with our food. Like, where is this coming from? What are the ethical implications? I think Violaine mentioned some of the, environmental implications of growing cannabis without certain regulations. So I'm also afraid that may happen, in Mexico. It's happening for other industries, such as avocado industry, where, big areas of forest are being destroyed to be able to grow avocado. So I'm afraid this can also open the door to that kind of like destructive agriculture of cannabis once it's legalized. So on one side, yes, we want it to pass because we don't want more people going to jail for like smoking one joint, especially because we know it has a class issue, it has a race issue. But on the other side, there's a lot of organizations that are pushing for fair legislation for the peasants, like in the same sense that Laura mentioned. And I think that's kind of like the parallel or the analogy to what Laura was saying. So if we can pass to the questions or the comments of the public, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fernanda and Laura. Like I'm learning a lot from both of you about the context and history of cannabis in both countries. So thank you so much. I think we should definitely jump into Q&As. There's a lot of really interesting questions. One of them is from Kia. So what is cannabis education like in your respective countries? Do you feel it had an impact on the communities around you? So I can start because I think my answer is quite straightforward. In Canada, it's very much an abstinence approach, right? It's seen as one of like the hardest drugs as well. And actually, it's interesting that when Canada was legalizing cannabis, there were like foreign officials from China that were urging Chinese young people in Canada not to smoke marijuana. So that's just kind of the evidence of the cultural a perspective from China. And so I mean, but the young people are actually, more open to smoking weed. There, you definitely observe a lot more young people smoking weed in China than previously. And I'm sure it's because of an influence from Western societies and, people traveling back from other countries and continue to smoke. And China is like one of the largest medicinal marijuana producers in the world. So that just kind of gives you that context. But for sure, I feel like it would benefit a lot more if there's more education about cannabis in China, especially how it's locally produced.
Right. And if I can just add in something about the Canadian context in terms of education, I went through elementary and school and high school and CEGEP here and university in Quebec. But I think from what we've seen in our work through Project VoxCan while discussing with youth about what type of education they've received and what they would have liked to have in terms of educational strategies, there's still, like Coco said, is very abstinence and fear-based, but I think there's this component of right at the beginning when you're first introduced to cannabis, it is usually by a police officer who are called PIMS. So it's like this police force that is found in schools, especially in high schools, and who are, they can deal with like bullying issues and like harassment issues that youth go through, but they're also tasked with giving out this education on substances and cannabis use. So most kids who go through high schools in Quebec, and I'm imagining this will be similar in other parts of the world, their first encounter with cannabis knowledge will be given by a police officer who, of course, doesn't have harm reduction at heart. They are not really interested in giving fact-based or evidence-based information. They're mostly interested in just instilling fear in youth and having them just ignore cannabis, which we know is unrealistic. And this leads to even higher rates of poor public health because youth will have to experiment by themselves and find out what works and what doesn't work. And the most lucky will go through it without any big issue. But there will always be some people who fall in between those traps and who really will be hurt by their experimentation with drugs, especially if they're not from a safe supply.
Sorry, if I could add to that, there's one like really interesting legal aspect of branding of cannabis products in Canada. I think we all kind of know that we were raised in this do not use mentality. And when it was legalized, people thought maybe the government is shifting gears, giving more power to the youth to kind of make their own calls. But there are a lot of regulations around the branding of the products saying that they can't look too cute, too attractive for kids. And that's why we have these products that are like in gross colors, look like they're something you wouldn't want to consume. And I think that that's just evidence that like adults and the government still have that mentality of swaying kids away from use.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love to hear also from you, Fernanda and Stan, like where you grew up and how you learned about cannabis. What's the education like? And also, I just want to be conscious of the time. So I also want to bring up another really closely associated question by Doug. Like, how do we then better educate youth and about, potential harms in such as psychosis, addiction, as Laura mentioned, maybe like the security police folks are not the best people to be the first encounter about cannabis. So maybe what was your experience like, Fernanda, Stan, and what would be your suggestion?
Do you want to go, Fernanda?
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
We got it.
My experience in Mexico was particular. I mean, I think there's a lot of stigma in Mexico still. Mexico is a very Catholic society and a very conservative society. And when I was in high school, it would be like the old tactic of bringing like a rehab person come to school and speak about how bad his experience with drugs was and how he ended up in prostitution and terrible story of his life, which was kind of like shocking way of presenting us with the subject of using drugs. I think we were in elementary school or something like that, like 6th grade of elementary school or something like that. So it's kind of like, this is what will happen to you if you use drugs, with no nuances on, it's not the same thing to sniff glue or use cannabis or morphine, or there's a wide range. And then I think there's a lot of stigma, even like among medical doctors, for example. I still find a lot of like resistance. I'm sometimes on groups, Facebook groups of other physicians. When they were discussing legalizations, there were a lot of like people that say like, no, why are you going to do this? We're going to have like a rise in mental health problems and psychotic breaks. And sometimes they're not really like, I know that the evidence has accumulated a lot in the last years of like, and there's still a lot of we don't know. So related to Doc's question, we do know that there's a risk, like augmented risk of psychotic episodes in someone who is using high potency cannabis. So cannabis with a lot of THC, but it's not only using high THC, it's using high THC cannabis very often, and a lot of other social, like psychosociological variables and genetic variables. So if you have some kind of predisposition, and this is kind of like what has to be added into the discussion, I feel like a little bit everywhere. Like there's this idea, oh, if you smoke marijuana, you're going to develop schizophrenia. It's like, no, it has nothing to do with that. But it doesn't mean that it's completely safe. Oh, go do all the cannabis you want and you'll be fine. A conversation has to be nuanced and kind of go back to what exactly is psychosis, what exactly is addiction, because there is general knowledge lacking on those topics. So general population don't know the difference between psychosis and schizophrenia. So it really comes to public health education, and I think sharing the idea of evidence-based. This is what we know. How do we know? Well, we ran this study. We did statistics. We saw it in this population or that population, and we know it's multidimensional, multifactorial, and nuanced. And that's the idea, like sharing with people that there are studies that are being done and the evidence is changing. And also that one thing we know is that early frequent use of high potency cannabis has more risks than, risk like use later in life. But of course, there's other substances like alcohol or even like nicotine, tobacco, and it's that brings a lot of other risks that haven't been as stigmatized. So I think the idea why we have been able to discuss some of the risks of tobacco and alcohol, well, in the case that it has been done, right, it has been done without stigma, saying, well, it's okay if you want to get a beer, but know that there is alcoholism, it can be bad to your liver. And I think that's the approach we have to bring to cannabis, which is easier with legalization. And another thing, just before passing the mic to Stan, is kind of like what we have been doing in VoxCan is trying to bring open conversations to youth from other youth members, like saying, look, in an open way, I am not a policeman. I am not an ex-drug addict telling you the terrible story of my life. I am not your mom or your dad or some kind of position of authority. Like in that way, you can also open the opportunity for these people to share with you, for youth to share their own views. And I do think, and that's something we're trying to do as well, that it is imperative to bring this knowledge to social media, to, well, Facebook is for old people now, but Instagram and TikTok, I think a lot of people are getting their education. A lot of youth are getting their education from there now. And that's a trend, and it's going to be hard to change. So we have to, and there's a lot of misinformation there that becomes viral like this. So if we get a way, if we can find a way to make this, scientific-based information fun and viral to reach the community members, I think that would be a good way to approach this. So go ahead, Stan.
I'm aware of the time constraint, so I won't keep this too long. But generally, my impression and my education on cannabis when I was younger is very similar to what Laura was explaining. It like someone from law enforcement coming to school and simply discussing those things. And I never, for example, like very quick, I've never heard anything about harm reduction, even just the term, whether in English or in French, before I moved to Canada, which already says a lot about differences between these two places. And through VoxCan and developing the program that VoxCan has done, it's been even personally been an incredible journey of understanding what open conversation can do about learning pretty much about anything, but particularly about such sensitive subjects that are so taboo in society. And through the conversations we've had with students in schools, we can see that we all have different questions, different worries, but sometimes these questions are the same, and we never knew or anyone or how to address them. And it feels very reassuring to see that many people are in the same boat, and that those questions are universal in many, because cannabis is around youth's daily, depending on where we live. If it's in Canada, for example, it's something that is around everyone, and I believe it is normal for everyone to be able to be asked any question, especially in the case of when you go to school, you're being asked about, like, you're learning about history, you're learning about many things, but then health and things that are around you. Why wouldn't you be able to ask about tobacco? But why, like, you're able to ask about tobacco, but why not cannabis, even though it is incredibly common? Or alcohol. Like, alcohol has such a bigger place in society, and cannabis, so, like, it does too, but we're not treating things the same way. So I think having an open conversation changes a lot of things.
Thank you, Stan, and thank you, everybody, for your answer in this question. So just making sure, we are just going to have one last question, and maybe this one will be directed at Fernanda, given that she is our medical expert. So we have a question from Thomas, who's asking, what about mental health therapies with cannabis? Is there any research in that field? So I know in our previous discussions with Fernanda that she's told us more about, like, the treatment for more physical illnesses, but what is going on in terms of mental health therapies?
Yeah, so as I was saying before, we're building evidence, right? And there are studies that start complementing each other, and we start accumulating evidence until we have sufficient evidence. That's how we go, in biomedical paradigm. We look at a series of studies, and then you evaluate the quality of the evidence. So in terms of cannabis, what we have like bigger evidence for is for the role of cannabis for treating pain, for treating nausea and vomiting associated to chemotherapy, and for inducing appetite in either people also that are undergoing treatment with chemotherapy, or people, for example, with AIDS, that have this syndrome in which they don't have, like, they don't feel appetite anymore. So to stimulate hunger. This same mechanism of stimulating hunger and stimulating appetite, it's being researched for example, people with anorexia nervosa. That's THC, because there are some uses that are more associated with THC and others for CBD. In terms of mental health, it's mostly CBD. THC has been proposed as a potential appetite inducer in people like rehabilitating from anorexia nervosa. But the rest of the research has been mostly done with CBD. There's research that has been done with CBD for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, either CBD or a combination of THC and CBD, because it increases sleep quality and because it seems to decrease the amount of dreams or recall dreams. And we know that people with post-traumatic stress disorder have a lot of nightmares. So it has been proposed and there have been some studies, but the evidence is not strong enough to say this is a treatment for it. Then also something interesting is that for substance use disorders, CBD has been explored like some kind of anti-addictive potential. It has been proposed, it has started to be looked at, but nothing definite yet. And another interesting thing is what it has been it's not really mental health related, but it has been proposed to be like a substitute of prescription opioids, because it's for chronic pain, because of all the opioid epidemic that we have seen in North America and other places in the world. And last thing we know that is for anxiety, because we know that a lot of people self-medicate with cannabis for anxiety. And it is no doubt there is a relationship between cannabis and anxiety, but the relationship is a little bit complex because so first there's this kind of opposition between THC and CBD. High THC can actually make you more anxious, while CBD has a more relaxing effect. But even THC, depending to vulnerability of some people, it can decrease anxiety in some people and increase anxiety in some other people. So that's why it makes it so complicated. But now, research is more looking towards CBD as an anxiety, against, as a potential treatment against anxiety, especially because of the body components, the corporal components of what CBD does. When you have anxiety, there's a psychological part of anxiety and a physiological body part of anxiety. And CBD decreases the latter. So it decreases your activation you feel in the body that kind of feeds the same idea in the head and potentiates anxiety. So there's research being done on that, but still, if you go to, for example, Cochrane, which is the medical database that tells you the quality of the evidence based on how many studies have been done and what has been found, you won't find any recommendation yet for CBD or THC in mental health conditions. But I think definitely it has to be explored because people are using it anyway to self-medicate.
Thank you, Fernanda. And I know that we've had some more questions coming in about different health aspects and potential harms that we should be on the lookout for. Unfortunately, we won't have time to expand on that topic because we're already past time. But I would just like to thank Kia for reminding us that Cannabis and Psychosis as a full website full of different resources, such as video capsules and more information on the link to explore the link between cannabis and psychosis. So if you're interested in delving in deeper on this topic, you can visit the website that is on your screen. And I'll just let Coco finish off this amazing discussion session. I would like to thank everybody for joining us, both our panel of experts and the audience that was tuned in this evening. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. As Laura said, we didn't have enough time to get to all the questions. We can talk about any of these topics above all day. But that is why we have catered a part 2 of the series in May 20th. So please go and RSVP on the event so you don't forget. If you can just re-click that comment. And follow Cannabis and Psychosis and VoxCan on our Facebook pages, and to learn more and keep us updated. We will have really exciting experts and to have even more insights on these topics. So we're very excited to have them. And yeah, just wanting to acknowledge that we want to thank Cannabis and Psychosis, Schizophrenia Society of Canada, and GRIP as well, all these organizations who are doing amazing work in harm reduction, drug policy, research, and supporting us to provide this event for all of you. And please RSVP, and we thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. And just one last reminder, Cannabis in Psychosis has asked us to share this link to fill out the review survey. So just to let you know how you found this discussion session and if there's anything we should be on the lookout for next time. Thank you, Violin, Fernanda, and Stan for joining us, and we'll see each other very soon. And thank you for all of your expertise and insights.
Thank you for hosting this. Bye-bye.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much. Have a great day. End of the day.
Or night.
Oh, night. Yes, I'm going to bed.
Bye-bye.
Bye.